films, two cinephiles, one podcast.
Cinema is my secret passion.
It's a foreign movie. A film is what it is.
But art films make people feel funny.
This film was a personal vision, not a marketing machine.
We're getting too many mainstream movies.
Episode 10, Violence and Redemption. Why, we're back.
We are, after what won't seem like to people as a hiatus, but it was a hiatus for us.
There was a hiatus. It was just in the episodes coming out, not actually in the episodes recording. I'm Kyle Mahaney.
I'm Sarah Page.
And we have a guest with us once again. Today, we have Mother Maryann Sturges, who is a priest in the Episcopal Church from the Diocese of Bethlehem.
Hi.
Welcome.
Glad I'm here. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. And today, we really wanted to have you on because we're going to be talking about Scorsese's films that pertain to faith today, because he has such an interesting lens in how he approaches the idea of religion. And there's obvious examples here. We could be talking about The Last Temptation of Jesus Christ. We could be talking about Goodfellas. We could be talking about Kundun. We could be talking about a lot of things, but he has a couple of films now that deal with the idea of redemption in a Christian worldview in the light of overwhelming violence in the world, whether these are our characters creating violence in two of these films or our characters having impossible choices in how they react to violence. This week, we'll be talking about Raging Bull, Silence, and The Killers of the Flower Moon, which just recently had a long and fairly successful theatrical run. So we're starting with Raging Bull, which was directed by Martin Scorsese in the year 1980. Kind of notable as the first big film from Scorsese after the success of Taxi Driver, after the success of Mean Streets. We're really seeing him have a lot of creative freedom here. And also we're seeing a downturn in the entire new Hollywood movement that he's kind of taking in and reacting to. He was on the record saying while preparing this movie that he thought it could possibly be the last major motion picture he'd ever have a chance to make in an era where studios were spending less and less money on adult dramas and pivoting away from these serious movies of the 1970s. Of course, this was not the last major feature film Martin Scorsese made. In fact, today we would consider it one of his early films. But it comes at an odd time, especially given the partnership with Robert De Niro, who takes the lead, and as well as Joe Pesci. But De Niro has just come off of this incredible streak with The Godfather Part 2, The Deer Hunter. He is kind of become this hero of the adult drama. And Scorsese hands him this intensely physical role with him yo-yoing up and down in weight to achieve this film, 40 pounds, against all real ideas of healthiness, to present what is a very physical performance. But I think just how emotional Robert De Niro's performance is often gets lost in the criticism of that. Raging Bull has widely been regarded as one of the greatest films of all time. It is available now in a 4K restoration from Criterion in both the US and the UK, and you can stream it on either MGM Plus or Criterion. Now, this is Martin Scorsese's second collaboration with screenwriter Paul Schrader, who also wrote Taxi Driver. But in this time, he's adapting it from the autobiography of Jake LaMotta himself. Schrader worked on an earlier draft written by Mardik Martin to craft this really sinister narrative of what is the world and what is a person when it comes to the nature of violence. And we'll be getting into that in a little bit. But it's not only a major milestone in his collaborations with Paul Schrader. It's also the first collaboration with longtime editor Thelma Schumacher on a narrative feature. Thelma Schumacher is one of the greatest living editors today, and she has edited almost every one of Martin Scorsese's films. We also see Michael Chapman, who is notable as being the cinematographer of Taxi Driver Return. Chapman also served as the head camera operator on films like Jaws and The Godfather. This is really the dream team that was being assembled at the tail end of this 1970s New Hollywood movement. The film, released to broad acclaim, was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Picture, Director. De Niro got a Best Actor nomination. Pesci got a supporting actor nomination, a supporting actress nomination for newcomer Kathy Moriarty, a cinematography nomination for Chapman, editing nomination for Thelma Schumacher, and sound design. It wound up winning awards for both De Niro and Schumacher. Despite the awards acclaim, the film actually opened initially in New York City to very polarizing reviews from critics who didn't seem to appreciate the balance of violence with the culture in the film. But over the course of the next 30 years, it went on to become widely regarded as the greatest Scorsese film. To review the cast, it stars Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta, Joe Pesci as Joey LaMotta, his brother, and Kathy Moriarty, who is a newcomer who was discovered by Joe Pesci as Vicky LaMotta.
Yeah, so to go into a one-sentence summary, I would describe this movie as a movie where kind of awful people do awful things to each other for an hour, 45 minutes. But to kind of go into the nitty-gritty of it, it's set in 1941. Jake LaMotta is a middleweight boxer working his way up to the top. Film really follows his rise and then fall as he self-sabotages his own life and happiness. He has his brother Joey at his side, who is his best friend, acts as his manager, and Jake is, at the beginning of the film, in this unhappy marriage that he then leaves to date and then marry a girl named Vicky, a 15-year-old who he falls in love with. We can talk a lot with that there. Jake is incredibly violent and aggressive both in and out of the boxing ring. So in 1943, he defeated Sugar Ray Robinson in the ring. And then on the rematch, despite seeming to have secured a second win, the judges favored Robinson. Due to his violent nature, Jake is controlling, constantly suspicious of Vicky, accusing her of cheating on him, not loving him. He charges his brother Joey with keeping an eye on her and making sure that she's not cheating on him. Joey gets into this awful brawl at a bar when he mistakes Vicky for flirting with someone who isn't Jake. And Jake is forced to basically take a loss in the ring to make up for this. After various challenges, Jake achieves middleweight boxing champion title, but you would think that that would be the peak of his happiness, but it kind of just all goes downhill from there. His paranoia becomes worse. He spirals in his treatment of Vicky and of his brother. He's just incredibly abusive and suspicious of both of them. During a fight, Vicky even says in a joking way that she is actually cheating on Jake with Joey. And Jake, in a rage, storms to Joey's home, beats him in front of his wife, and later also strikes Vicky. The brothers' relationship never recovers from this incident, and Jake's boxing career starts to decline along with it. He later is shown opening a club, and it seems like his life might be turning up again. After, however, a night of drinking and flirting with girls at his club, he is greeted by Vicky, advising him that she wants a divorce and custody of their kids. He is then later arrested for being accused of introducing underage girls to men at his bar, something we don't see explicitly in the movie, but we don't find it very hard to believe considering all the things he's done up until that moment. He tries to pay his bail using the jewels from his championship belt, but is unsuccessful. And he ends up in jail cursing himself and how his life got there in this really amazing performance from De Niro, just having a mental breakdown in a jail cell. At the end of the movie, we see an even older Jake who is all alone doing subpar stand-up comedy in clubs that are not his. His pre-show routine, which we actually open on at the beginning of the movie, and then we also end with, includes him just sort of shadowboxing by himself in the back and hyping himself up. And I believe he also quotes a famous monologue.
Yeah, he's quoting the monologue from On the Waterfront.
Yes, that was it. But yeah, and that is kind of the plot summary. The end title card features a biblical quote from John 9:25 that reads, "So, for the second time, the Pharisees summoned the man who had been blind and said, 'Speak the truth before God. We know this fellow is a sinner. Whether or not he is a sinner, I do not know.' The man replied, 'All I know is this. Once I was blind, and now I can see.'"
So Scorsese is not being subtle here in telling us that he's really thinking about the idea of sin and redemption throughout this movie. You have a film that, for the most part, is set in the neighborhood Scorsese grew up in. It all, I believe, is in Queens. And the Italian Catholic nature of that neighborhood is a part of the social order, to the point where we even see, young men out in the town looking to get lucky, joking about it with the parish priest from the neighborhood. It is a ingrained part of the culture where the faith is so blended with the mentality of mob leadership, of the violence of the culture. It's kind of hard to discern ethics.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me, like shots in the movie that have like signs of the cross or, you know, crucifixes over people's beds and such like then paired with
literally domestic violence happening between an
yes.
icon of Jesus and an icon of the Virgin Mary.
Yes.
Yeah.
You also have, you know, this film, along with Taxi Driver, seems to be that special kind of film where Scorsese is talking about toxic masculinity a lot in an era before the word toxic masculinity was really even something we had. Yet it also seems to be a film beloved by those, quite frankly, who are the most likely to be accused of being toxic and how they express their masculinity. So I think that's an interesting duality that he is able to tell this narrative where he's pretty clear about what he's saying as the narrative. It also becomes a rallying cry in many ways for those who are not on the same page and see a hero in this character.
I actually don't know that Scorsese is condemning Jake LaMotta.
I don't think he's condemning Jake. I think he's condemning everything around Jake.
I don't know. I think Jake's actions are kind of like it's hard to understand why he's doing what he's doing in some of the scenes. I'm thinking of that scene, kind of his last fight where he lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was so violent.
Yeah.
And he just seemed to like want to be beat up at that point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he didn't let himself fall. And even at the end, right, when the other guy won, he went and was like, I didn't fall.
Yeah, I think he like over the course of this movie, despite the fact that he's one of the most like loud and on the surface level, quote unquote, expressive people, he actually doesn't ever really well explain his emotions, how he's feeling, what he wants, who he is. He just lashes out he's like purely reactionary on every single situation he finds himself in.
I also think there's a lot of exaggeration and projection in his entire approach to his insecurities, which are, is he strong enough? Does he have the girl? Does he have all of these things, which we see as being valued by the culture around him? We can see from his conversations with his brother how in their own ways, they are both trying to project confidence in their masculinity. His brother is doing that through, you know, nudging up next to mob power and wearing fine clothing at all times and looking impeccably dressed. He is doing it through the fame that he is rapidly gaining from his boxing.
Yeah, in turn, like I don't think I feel like a moral judgment is placed on Jake, but I do think this film really strongly illustrates like how people can be produced from these environments, right? And the like cycle of violence that they'll perpetuate on themselves and then also like others around them.
We see this in a couple ways. You know, when we first see the kind of happy honeymoon era of his relationship with Vicky, we see the neighborhood around him where it's pretty clear the apartments next to them, the domestic situations are violent. They're degrading. They're dangerous.
But it's also, he's having an affair with her, right? Like he's married to someone else.
Yep.
And
the film doesn't dwell on the fact, on the closing of that relationship and the divorce because it's not important to him. I also looked up, he was 19 years old when he married her. So he was getting divorced at 19. That's a lot.
how old was he when he got married for the first time?
18.
Oh my goodness. So like only a year in. Okay. I mean,
that also makes Vicky being 15 a little understandable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Still a yikes, but not as outrageous of a yikes.
And Vicky is never portrayed as being naive in the film. I think that's an interesting choice. She is in a world surrounded by mobsters. I read an essay that discussed how in many ways she is portrayed as understanding the dangers of the mobsters, but she isn't prepared for the danger of Jake in how he internalizes his violence. And I think that's a really interesting lens to look at.
And I think she is portrayed as truly loving him.
Yeah.
Right?
Until she can't anymore. Yeah.
Right. Like, I think that scene after they've gotten in the fight and they're in their bedroom and you see the cross hanging over their bed.
Yeah.
Right. And then he just hugs her. And it's like, in that moment, it's like, it didn't matter.
Yeah. For me, when I first watched that, I was like, oh, is this like going to be a turning point? Because I was not aware of like LaMotta's life story prior to watching this film. So I was like, oh, is this like a turning point for the characters? And then like, you know, and Vicky, I think, stays with him for like 10 years before she divorces him, because there's a significant time skip between, you know, that kind of resolution and then the nightclub and the divorce.
Yeah, we go from the mid 40s to the late 50s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. She didn't just turn around and leave. Like, she stayed with him for a very long time.
It's also unclear to me if she was actually cheating on him.
There's no indication that she was, other than going out and meeting with the local muscle, which there could be plenty of reasons for that, especially given Jake is a target of a lot of interest from the mob.
Yeah.
I kind of felt like maybe she was playing with boundaries a little bit. Like, she's not like you said, like a naive, quiet, like, oh, I'll just wilt in the corner, for lack of a better term. Like, she, you know, talks back to Jake. She like sasses him. She says stuff that had me being like, oh, don't say that. That's going to make it worse. I think maybe like talking with those members of the mob, talking with other men, things like that. Maybe she's not necessarily like cheating, but she's sort of playing with Joey's emotions and Jake's emotions and like playing with the boundaries that they've put for her.
I think also I definitely read that she knew Joey was watching her.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but Joey is one of the people she's accused of cheating with.
Yeah.
Which also would.
Yeah.
I don't know. I felt like that could have been a real thing that happened.
Especially when you look at the early interactions, it's possible.
Right.
Here's the thing: is it doesn't really matter, because the story there is not whether she cheated with him, because we also have no reason to believe he's been faithful, quite frankly.
Oh, no, he's not been faithful.
The story there is his insecurity and reaction.
Yeah. Right, which is always the story in toxic masculinity, right? It's never actually about what the woman did or didn't do, right?
Right.
It's about the man and their own insecurity.
And he takes on this role of being a strong man. We see this obviously in that very violent scene of him, you know, beating the crap out of his brother. But we also start to see that darker giving into his violent tendencies in how he goes about his fights and how he handles other interactions. You start to see that's really the moment where you start to see this unraveling from his internal paranoia of him not being good enough. And that's what I think that a lot of that is, him not being good enough to be worthy of someone who loves him like that, which he exercises through control, and it's super toxic and gross. But after that fight, we see him play the role of strongman, you know, be a lot quicker to rage, be a lot quicker to lash out, enjoy the violence. You can see in De Niro's performance, he is starting to thrive on violence. And Sarah, you talked about that last fight where he is just wailing on his opponent even though he's already lost. I think a comparison is in how Scorsese frames it, because it really shows you the brutality of that violence. There's a ton of cuts in that sequence, and you get every angle of just how violent it is. But if you compare that to the first fight we see of his, the brutality is cut very similarly, but it's not cut around the action of the fight. It's cut around the violence of the crowd watching it and what the fight does to the crowd. And I think that is really interesting in how that has evolved. Has the viewing audience evolved? I don't think so. I think it's a downfall of Jake and how he has evolved.
Yeah. And also the idea of like, when we talk about violence for entertainment, you know, a boxing match is essentially violence for entertainment. And there's maybe a little bit of a meta aspect of us watching this movie, watching this crowd, watching these fights for entertainment, the way the violence is portrayed, like you said at the beginning, the crowd is violent, but the fight is entertainment. And then by the end, you're like, the violence is no longer entertaining for you, the viewer, or for the crowd. Like, it's just brutal cuts of like blood going everywhere and these two guys just absolutely destroying one another. And so it does kind of leave you with being like, okay, well, I just watched this fight and I'm not entertained.
And I think they highlight that really well in that when they're announcing the winner, the screen doesn't show the winner. It shows the blood on the rope. Right?
Absolutely.
And so it's like,
what was the cost?
Right.
I mean, I don't watch boxing. I don't watch any form of, fighting. The last time I watched a boxing match, Sarah, was with your sister, and I believe it was the first time either of us had sat through a boxing match. And let me tell you, I think that was almost a decade ago.
Yeah, I've never been to a boxing match in my life.
Me
Probably
neither.
never will.
No.
I think a comparison that is a little more publicly accessible that we've seen crop up over the last couple decades is NASCAR racing. How many people do you hear say, oh, I don't watch it for the race? What do they watch it for?
Crashes.
They watch it for the crashes. They want to see if there's going to be a big boom and maybe someone dies. Of course, they'll be very sad if someone dies. But that is the event. It is like Roman Colosseum.
I was going to say,
levels.
It's like when there's a beheading in the local square and it's like, all right, Jerry, we're going to go watch a beheading today because I ain't got anything better to do. Like, that's what it reminds me of. It's like, wow, we've come so far. Well, actually, no, we just enjoy watching potential disaster be seen upon strangers.
Strangers who are richer than us. And I do think this film has a lot to say about class while saying very little. The LaMottas clearly are not from money. However, Jake has come into money. And that is a very interesting factor of he doesn't seem to know how to manage his finances or his fame for that matter. He doesn't seem to have the advice of someone with his means, the resources someone with his means would usually have.
But part of that is because he's alienated the people who should be helping him, right?
Yeah.
So like his wife, his sister, he's at the end, right? He's all alone trying
Absolutely.
to psych himself up for this performance. When he goes to jail, he's all alone. And so there's this sense of like the violence kind of cost him all of those relationships.
And even earlier on, you have the choice to throw the fight. Someone should probably have coached him through that situation and what is, it's an impossible situation caused by his brother's violence. But his brother's violence occurred essentially on his orders. He didn't know it was going to occur, but his brother was doing it for him. This is the chain of violence, and there would have been repercussions, obviously, for him if he didn't agree to throw the match. That is the nature of dealing with the mob, and sports were so profoundly mobbed up in this era. But he doesn't think. He doesn't reflect on the weight and consequences, or quite frankly, maybe he should do a better job of throwing the match.
Yeah, I think because his brain is so like, I must be the strong man and is so attuned to violence that he cannot conceptualize of throwing the fight, because throwing the fight, if you made a good show of throwing it, would still be like false. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas if he just like
he doesn't participate,
drops and doesn't participate, then he still gets to walk away with his like masculinity intact. It was or his toxic masculinity intact, to be clear. What I kind of think about is the fact no one in this movie like knows how to verbalize their feelings to each other. So it's Joey being really violent on Jake's behalf, which might be seen as a gesture of love for his brother, but it just causes his brother more harm and causes Joey a lot of harm.
I think the closest we get to a genuine conversation about feelings is Jake and Joey after, I think it's the first fight, when Joey is in this impeccable suit and Jake is expressing that he doesn't believe he's cut out for it. He's really having a low point. And he asks Joey to hit him. And Joey doesn't want to do that. And they're both at this point where they're having to check the things that make them the most insecure. And they're both unable to actually do that.
Yeah, and I think like contrasting where they are as brothers at the beginning of the movie versus the end, because Jake does have a bit of an arc in the sense that like he goes from being like this like I'm strong and I don't need anybody and like whatever to like when he sees Joey in the street like years later, he's like desperate for human connection. He's like, give me a kiss, like how have you been, like we should talk sometime. And that is like very out of character with actually like the profile of Jake you get at the beginning of the movie.
He's lost everything. He's at his lowest point. But also, I think it's worth noting that we don't see what Joey's path is during those 15 years. And quite frankly, that scene is incredibly uncomfortable because he forces a lot of physical affection in apology on Joey, which is very clearly not welcome. It feels like assault.
Yeah, it does.
And it's clearly more about Jake than about Joey.
Yeah, it's self-serving.
Right. Jake needs that. He's alone, right? He has some woman who knows, right, like what that relationship is with that woman that he leaves in the taxi when he goes to go talk to Joey. And he just like, he needs to know that he's worthy, right? He's looking for someone who will tell him that he's worthy. And he's hoping that someone will be his brother.
Yeah. And by that point, it's like, it's too late. Like he can't get that back.
Right.
It's not even just it's too long. It's the way he went about that interaction was definitely not going to get that. It just reinforced everything.
Because it's, again, an inability to express like your feelings and how you, like he can only do things physically.
I find it interesting that so the story is bookended on both ends by this. He's in the 1960s working as basically an MC in a variety of clubs. He's doing comedy, he's doing hosting. The clubs are fairly seedy. The last club he's at is clearly like this classic Times Square strip joint. And you see he's internalized a lot of that violence. He's not it's still a very externally masculine performance, but he's channeling in different ways. He's carrying himself in a different way. But ultimately, you have to wonder, has he actually changed that much? Because he's just chanting to himself, I'm the boss, I'm the boss, I'm the boss. Is that actually moving away from his violent reactions? Or is it just redirecting it into something new, something he could craft in a more palatable way?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it gives us, like, I felt like that final scene in the 60s, which is also where we started, right? So it's interesting to like go full circle. You're seeing someone who is trying to convince themselves that they are worthy, that they still have what they need. And they clearly are not at the peak of their success or at the peak of their abilities, right? It feels very, very forced.
Yep. And yet, at every point on his rise to the top of being the world champion in his class, we see him express that same vulnerability and never feel confident in his ability.
Right. Which is why he couldn't stay in it, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he had to leave in the way that he left, right?
And there's a lot we can talk about as far as how is the world around him portrayed. But let's talk a little bit about how Scorsese chooses to frame Vicky. From the moment we first see Vicky on screen, through the cinematography, Scorsese conveys the gaze that Jake has for her. And it is an incredibly centered and tight gaze. He has eyes for no one else. It lets us know immediately the kinds of initial objectification that's happening just through the language of the cinema. It's suggested later on that she truly loves him, but does he truly love her, or is he love the idea of her?
I feel like he loves her devotion to him. Right? Because he's this, he's so insecure, and she's so beautiful, right? She's like that archetypal beauty.
Yep.
And so having her as his woman gives him this status, right? Gives him this ability to be the man in a way that he can't get it he can't have that status other ways. And so I don't know that he's capable of truly loving, right? Yeah. Just because of how insecure and how his understanding of himself is so damaged.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How can anyone with that much, like, I guess, like, toxic masculinity and self-doubt really, like, truly, like, love another person?
It's easy to love an idea. It's harder to actually love someone as they are.
Right. Which is why he ends up driving her away, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because he has this image of, like, her as his woman being this exact perfect thing. And anytime she remotely strays from that idea that he's built of her, it's like it's a challenge and affront to him.
Mm-hmm.
And even when he gets arrested by the Vice Squad in the later stages of the film and needs to come to the home they had once shared to retrieve his championship belt, there's a tolerance that we see from her that probably shouldn't be there, because you can see on some level she still loves him, and he throws that in her face. You know,
I mean, yeah.
Almost immediately.
And he's also an idiot.
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
I mean, just like he destroys the championship belt, which is probably worth more money than...
He sees the jewels as the value, not the identity, not the story.
Not the belt itself. And so he probably had enough money if he just had the belt itself. Which I guess that's kind of symbolic of his relationship with Vicky, right? He doesn't see her as an entirety. He sees her for the parts, the values, right? As his wife, as his lover, as the mother of his children, but doesn't see her as a human being.
I also think that might be a reflection on his viewing of himself. He sees the trophies. He doesn't actually see what he's done with his life. He doesn't see, you know, how he was meaningful, how he changed the sport. He sees none of that. He just sees what it got him.
Right.
Yeah, there's something about him, like, breaking into this house that, you know, he bought and pulling the jewels out of this belt that's his while breaking dishes while his wife is, like, telling him to be quiet because the kids are trying to sleep, where you're like, wow, you really could have had all of this if you just, you know, made a few different choices. Like, he's literally ripping the jewels out of his belt as, like, his life is, like, basically collapsing around him.
This film very bluntly portrays violence in a lot of different ways, and I find it really interesting that in the big theatrical displays of violence, we get a lot of very fast, very stylized cutting. But in the very hard to watch portrayals of domestic violence, we usually don't see that. Scorsese stays wide and chooses longer takes where we have to see the entire course of action. We have to live with, in a very unstylized way, what he has done. What do we think about his arrest and that whole saga? That is a challenging part of the film because he's really lost at sea in many ways at this point. He's lost his family. He's lost his fame. He's struggling financially with his club while getting the attention that he wants. Just from the fact that he has the DA in his club tells me that club is not his money. That's mob money. I think we're very clearly meant to read it that way.
Oh, okay.
I don't think it's an accident the DA is sitting there, or it could have been would the DA be there if it was a sting?
No.
Yeah, I think that's saying the mob is rubbing his shoulders.
Yeah, that part's set in Florida, which I thought was interesting, right? Like he left New York after it, like the rupture with his brother,
and it's
was also like
it's the late
geographical
50s
rupture.
when the mob is moving to Florida and Las Vegas.
Yeah.
So I read that very clearly as like the stereotypical mob club.
So I will say I didn't think much about the mob factor, but what I thought was really a bit disturbing was when there were two young women who were coming into the club.
Yep.
And he was asked if they were over 21 and asked them to prove they were over 21 by kissing him.
Yep.
And then one of those young women, it turns out, was actually 14. Right?
Yeah.
And so to me, that is just disturbing. I don't really have any other word for, right? This like 50-something guy kind of forcing these young girls to kiss him, and who knows what else, right? Like that was like what we saw, but it left the impression that like there was more there. And I found it very disturbing that was where he'd gone.
It's a very alarming scene.
It is alarming. I also did not find it disturbing because it's basically what I expected from that. You know, you look at other portrayals of the, you know, men in the club scene in the late 50s, the early 60s. We talked about Last Night in Soho a few weeks ago. That film's entire plot revolves around a sex pest at a club like this. It's the same energy. It's manipulating the situation and the information and what the woman needs, because they just want to drink, they want to party. What they need is for him to validate them. So what does he want to get validated, to in exchange to validate them? He wants touch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think regarding the arrest specifically, I didn't have, like, in terms of asking for thoughts, I was kind of like, after all that's happened, this might as well happen. Like, I was like, this seems like a thing that might have happened. Because I was reading a little bit about this, because obviously this film is based off of, you know, it's about Jake LaMotta's life. And it was a little hazy. Like, he seemed to say that he, like, in real life had never done this, and the movie doesn't directly portray it. But the movie tells you enough about him as a person and, like, enough about the circumstances that were happening in that club right up until that arrest that had me going, like, yeah, this seems like an absolutely reasonable thing that you might have done and could be arrested for.
It's boys will be boys in locker room talk.
Right.
Contrast that to the scene when he's younger and they're out at a club and they're talking about, you know, swapping girls and getting laid. He is objectifying all of the female patrons of his club. So it's entirely believable to me that he would introduce someone for the purposes of them being exploited.
Yeah,
because we've seen this behavior throughout.
Absolutely tracks.
Right. Well, and like in the fact that when he was cheating on his wife with his future wife, right? He just expected his brother to go along with it. And they went out in public together, right? And then when his brother wanted to go out with someone who wasn't his brother's wife, they were just fine with it.
Yeah. It was an accepted cultural value.
Right. That women were there for decoration.
Yeah. Like there's this scene in the kitchen where they're like, the kids aren't in a lot of parts in this movie, but like it's where like the Jake and his brother and both of their wives are in the kitchen together. And Vicky tries to like actually connect and have a conversation about something with Jake and show like a genuine affection, like, and opinion on something. And the awful retaliation that Vicky and Joey's wife gets for like having an opinion in their own kitchen, you know, it's very striking. Like the way they're just like, you don't get to have an opinion. Get out there and watch the kids.
Mm-hmm.
There's also an intensely uncozy feeling about their home life. I was watching one of the video essays on the Criterion Disc makes a comment on the scene where they're all sitting in the living room with the kids on the floor, just playing. It looks like, and it just makes a comment that you fully understand that no one has ever sat in that cozy lounge chair behind them. And I think that really sums up that vibe. Everything is breaking in his life and he's not enjoying anything. The broken TV is another thing. Everything in his life is not quite right. And he doesn't know how to fix it. He doesn't know how to fix the TV.
Right.
Yeah.
And he's there trying to fix it while his brother's, you know, fussing at him about his weight and X, Y, and Z. And like,
The whole monologue when he's in his prison cell is very clearly a desire for redemption. It is a confession, but is it contrition? In the Christian tradition, contrition is usually considered a meaningful part that is necessary to one's absolution, right?
Right.
I don't think he ever reaches a point of self-understanding enough to see. He understands his circumstances, but I don't think he understands the actions that led to his circumstances.
I would definitely agree with that, because we see him continuing those actions after that, right?
Absolutely.
It's not like he becomes a different person after that moment and is aware of what.
It's the same self-destruction, just angrier and meaner and more alone.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious about what that final title at the end, the Bible verse that was shown.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of surprised me.
It feels odd.
It does
really
feel
does.
odd. And I wonder, like, is Martin Scorsese trying to say that Jake is one of those characters in the Bible verse, right?
A reading I could almost go with is it's something that he would find comfort in, even though it doesn't actually apply to him. Because we see him misquote things about religion a couple of times in the film.
Mm-hmm.
He equates goodness with how much you put in the bag at Mass. We see a couple of different of just cultural misunderstandings of the theology of his church.
Right.
I don't think Scorsese's actually saying this is Jake misappropriating this quote, but it's an interesting reading.
Right. I wonder too if we're supposed to be the ones who are now able to see and understand because of this movie. Right? Like, is there something about, like, seeing this film that is supposed to open our eyes to what is happening with toxic masculinity or what is happening in the world, right? Like, is there a way that...
Yeah. I think what I kind of took from it was, like, the part before saying, like, whether or not he's a sinner, I do not know, the man replied. Because we were talking about Scorsese passing judgment on characters versus passing judgment on the morality of the world that they're in. And I kind of took it as, like, he's not passing a specific moral judgment on Jake as a character, but is kind of like what you were saying about being blind and now seeing. Like, I'm not passing judgment, but look at this, you know?
Right. Look at what's happened because of his actions, because of his violence.
Yeah.
And if we expand that verse out to the context, this is the story of Jesus healing the blind man.
Yes.
It's a story, it basically in two parts. The man was born blind and was basically devalued by his culture because it was hopeless. And then he is healed. And then at the very start of it, the disciples are asking Jesus, who sinned to create this, the man or his parents, so that he was born blind? And Christ says it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents. It was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. That's an interesting story to be pulling from, given the verse he's actually using is from when the Pharisees challenge that idea.
Right. This is like a really long this is like the last bit of a really long story, right? Of this healing, and then the healing being challenged by the Pharisees, the religious leaders, right? And so, yeah, I don't know what that means, but I think it's interesting to put it in that kind of context.
Yeah.
Of who is responsible, who is the one that sins, right? Like when there's something, I don't want to say bad for blind because I don't think that's an accurate description. But
unfortunately, I think in a lot of contemporary readings throughout history, I think that is the association people would make.
Right, but I think Jesus is explicitly challenging that, right?
Absolutely.
That it is not sinful.
Yeah.
Right? But the violence in the world, I think that is maybe the sin, and that we are now able to see that. see that toxic masculinity.
Also, I think it's challenging. This also lends to my opinion that throughout most of this film, Scorsese is criticizing the culture around these brothers rather than their actions themselves. He says very impartial on them, but I do think he takes a pretty hard stance on condemning the world around them's greed, the world around them's violence.
Yeah, and I don't think, like, just going back to the end Bible verse usage, I think it's interesting that he's using a verse from a story where, like, the people in the story, this like blind man has received like a miraculous, what could be considered a miraculous turnaround in his life. Mm-hmm. But the movie we just watched was about like a character who doesn't seem to get any kind of a miraculous turnaround. Like he's just, we are left to assume that Jake just kind of drifts off as in the direction that he was going in.
And by all accounts, he did. He basically was like a bit actor for the rest of his life. Yeah.
And I think like talking about like condemning the culture versus like the people who are produced by that culture. I feel like Scorsese doesn't even need to like go out of his way to condemn like the setting, because the violence and the like pain that is produced by that setting doesn't need a judgment pasted on it, because you will see very clearly like it is what it is and it's violence.
And I think we saw that, right, in the audience in that final fight, right? Like we saw the judges being like, "Oh my God, there's blood on us."
Yeah.
And that moment of, yes, this is what you're here to watch, right? This is the reality of what boxing is.
Yeah.
You also, I do think though, like the cinematography is such a departure in those sequences from how the rest of the film is shot. You have very naturalistic cinematography throughout most of this movie. You know, it's very plain, and those sequences are so stylized. I think it also has to be commenting on the power the camera itself has.
Which it clearly does, right? Like the way the story is told and the what Scorsese chooses to show versus not show on the screen.
Absolutely.
Right?
And we will be bringing that up again in our next two films as well. But we would be remiss without mentioning the choice that this film was made in black and white, which is well past being out of style for a major Hollywood drama at this point in 1980. And it's not only in black and white. There are sequences that are in color. And what are those sequences?
It would be like the home films.
Yeah. The authentic familial life.
Yeah, like the home films with LaMotta and Vicky, and their like little fun romantic life that they build together for like 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Yeah, I actually, when I first watched the movie, I didn't look and see when it came out. I was like, I just hit play, and I thought it was way older than it was because it was black and white. I was like, wait a second. Well,
also, this is also Scorsese's first really large budget film. So this is the first time where you can confidently say that wasn't a factor in the decision making.
I think I'm trying to remember, because I watched like an interview where they were talking about the choice to film in black and white, but I don't want to attribute the reasoning that I saw specifically to Scorsese, but I feel like there was discussion around the idea of like, when you're talking about the past and setting things in the past, making things feel like the past. So shooting in black and white does conjure that feeling of it being the 40s as opposed to it being when it was shot in the 80s.
Absolutely. And it's lit like films of the 40s. Mm-hmm. You also have the aspect of this film is unflinching in its violence. And I think if you had color, that would pose a problem for the Academy. You know, we are well past the era of the Hays Code. In fact, we're really approaching the peak of violence in American cinema when this came out. But I think the mature adult drama audience Scorsese was going for would have found it distasteful.
And like, to take it a step further, the scenes with domestic violence, like having that in color wouldn't like be like so much worse. I feel like, because when it is in black and white, there is a degree of separation you feel from the events. You're just kind of like, well, that's in the past. I like subconsciously.
Yeah. Or it's a story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of the cinematography, one of the most striking films the last decade for me is Martin Scorsese's Silence. This came out in 2016. Silence follows the extraordinary martyrdom of the Jesuit martyrs in Japan during the 1500s. It is an awe-inspiring film in many ways that you can purchase on Blu-ray from Paramount in the US or from Studio Canal in the UK. It's also streaming on Paramount Plus. Unfortunately, there is no 4K disc available despite the film coming out mere months before that format's launch, so hopefully at some point this can get some love.
It's adapted from the book by Endo Shusaku, a Japanese Catholic who wrote extensively about the complicated relationship between Japanese culture and Christianity.
And Scorsese has recently talked quite a bit about how his next film will be an adaptation of yet another one of Endo's books. This one, a modern, for the era, retelling of the life of Christ from a Japanese perspective. So that's something I'm very interested in looking at.
I did see that, and now I'm like, I need to read both of these books before this comes out. Yeah. The screenplay was written by Jay Cox and Martin Scorsese, and the book was also adapted by Japanese New Wave filmmaker Masahiro Shinoda in 1971. The cinematography in this movie is Rodrigo Prieto, who also worked on Brokeback Mountain, recently did Barbie, and also was the cinematographer for one of the other movies that we're talking about in this episode, Killers of the Flower Moon. It premiered at a special event held at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome, followed by a limited Oscar qualifying run in LA and New York. It expanded wide the following January. It was nominated for Best Cinematography at the Academy Awards and made many critics' best of lists. It stars Andrew Garfield as Sebastian Rodriguez, based on Giuseppe Chiara. Also stars Adam Driver as Francisco Garupe, and Liam Neeson as the Jesuit Cristavio Ferreira.
It's also worth noting that these are all largely based on real people.
It was a novel, though, wasn't it?
Yes, it is a novelization of the accounts of the hagiography of these martyrs.
Okay. Yeah, and they are saints in the Episcopal Church.
Yes.
So we recognize them.
Absolutely. It's worth noting that those who apostatized are not regarded as official martyrs. And that is really the conflict that we'll get into when we summarize this story in a second, is literally sainthood versus apostatizing for the good of your people. That is the moral proposition Scorsese is dealing with. Silence begins at a reign of terror throughout the Japanese Christian community. This film takes place in the early 1600s. Over the last 50 years, Jesuit and Franciscan communities have been decimated through cleansing of Christians. There is troubling news reaching St. Paul's College in Macau, which is a Jesuit institution, that a noted missionary of the Jesuits called Ferrero has supposedly apostatized, which is, to be clear, that means renounced his faith in order to avoid being executed for being a Christian. This shocks those who had once been his pupils when he taught at the school. And two young Jesuit priests, Rodriguez and Garupe, who clearly have a profound connection with this man, set off to Japan, guided by a fisherman, to basically find that this is not true. They're really hoping that they can explain this or have a reason. They're met very early on with the complicated state that Christianity is in the region. There are a lot of Christians in Japan, but they're being forced to live in silence or renounce their faith. At this time, the fisherman who is their guide reveals pretty early on that the only reason he's alive is he apostatized in order to save himself as his entire family was executed around him. This is the world we are going into. So pretty quickly, after arriving in the village of Timoji, the priests pretty quickly have the Christian populations gathered to celebrate the fact that for the first time in years, they have a priest to celebrate the sacraments and live their faith with. And you see this profound reflection of the priests not quite being prepared for how seriously these people take their faith. They've not been able to celebrate the sacraments with each other for a very long time, and it is a profound celebration. But things quickly turn horrifying as the danger of the local community comes into play. We see very quickly that there are attempts to ferret out where the Christians are gathering. There are attempts to intimidate. There are attempts to, through violence, just kill those who profess the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. In the midst of this, the two priests split up and go to two different islands to explore places where Ferreira had been seen to try to find information on what had happened to him. Now, Rodriguez goes to the Goto Island and finds it was basically utterly destroyed. And in the midst of this, he begins rebuilding a Christian population there, but is betrayed by the very fishermen who had brought them there, and is imprisoned for the crime of proselytizing Christianity. He is forced to watch as the flock he had gathered are tortured violently, and among them he sees that Garupe has been gathered among them, and they're forcing all of them to renounce their faith. Garupe refuses, and in a very powerful sequence, after refusing to renounce his faith, Garupe swims out to try to save the life of one of the tortured women who is drowning in the water. Eventually, the scene, we're left to basically understood that this is Garupe's fate. Rodriguez is now alone. And he is still holding to his faith, and he is still trying to minister to his flock by doing his best to keep them safe. But the first real challenge we see is when Kichiro, the fisherman who had betrayed him, is imprisoned right next to him and begs him to hear his confession. And he reluctantly, with great emotional effort, is willing to hear his confession and grant him the sacrament of absolution. After some time watching the Christians of this community be tortured in front of him while he is locked up, Rodriguez is eventually taken to meet Ferreira, who is fully assimilated into Japanese society. He apostatized to save his fellow Christians, we learn, and believes that Japan is incompatible with Christianity, or at least that is what he tells Rodriguez. He engages in helping the Japanese authorities to censor influence coming in from the West via trade to make sure that Christian artifacts, Christian texts, are not making it into Japan. The night that Rodriguez is first brought to Ferreira, they're forced to watch 5 Christians be tortured. And he starts to understand why Ferreira made the choice that he did. He really starts to become very conflicted over whether it is self-centered to refuse to recant his faith when he is causing the suffering of so many others. He is deeply conflicted at the idea of one soul versus many lives. He has a vision in the form of what he perceives to be Jesus, granting him permission to step on the fumi, which is a stone bearing the image of Christ, and the prisoners are all being told to apostatize by stepping on it in disgrace. And after hearing that permission, Rodriguez chooses to do it. He apostatizes. He takes a Japanese name. He lives a Japanese life. He takes a Japanese wife and joins Ferreira in their censorship practice. But we still see glimpses of doubt, of profound confliction in what they have done and the life they are living now. And they're both so guarded because of a culture of spies around them that they're not willing to openly discuss this. We only get brief glimpses of this. But Rodriguez continues to believe that he's hearing the voice of Jesus, who is assuring him that he is that Jesus is with him, suffering alongside him, and that they are making the right choice. There is continued scrutiny that they are continuing their Christianity in secret. And for many of their former parishioners, this is true. Kichiro is arrested again, having returned once again to his faith. And he was caught with an amulet with a Christian icon on it. And we never see him again. It's pretty easy to read that he's been executed. And this is kind of the end of our story here. Rodriguez lives out the rest of his life in Japan, and we see decades later that he is given a traditional Japanese funeral, and his wife engages in all of the offerings to ward off evil spirits, but in secret. She places a tiny crucifix that he had first come to the island with in the center of his coffin, indicating that despite apostatizing, he remained true his entire life. And that is our story. Woo.
Yeah.
This film, I've only watched it twice. First in theaters and second time just a few weeks ago for this. So, what a story.
It's such a heavy film, and I watched it right at the beginning of Holy Week.
Yep, same.
Which I think was a pretty fitting time to watch it. But also there's so much imagery and so much explicit religion in this film.
Absolutely.
And questions about what is faith and where is God.
Again, we're dealing a lot with the question of doubt as a core part of religion. This is something Scorsese touches on explicitly in Mean Streets. This is something that's implied, I think, at times in the portrayals of Catholicism in the glimpse of Catholicism that we get throughout Raging Bull. But it's also portrayed most notably in The Last Temptation of Christ, where we're able to see quite literally the doubts of Christ himself portrayed. And I find it interesting that Scorsese goes with the choice of using very similar. He's portraying the devil offering moral ideas and these hypotheticals versus this is so grounded in reality. You have to make a decision. People will die.
Right.
A lot of times these ideas about religious doubt don't have that physicality, don't have that certainty.
Although I think we have to remember that the people responsible for the violence is always the ones enacting it. And so when someone says, if you don't do X, I'm going to hurt so-and-so, right? Like your decision to hurt that, to like do X or not do whatever. Mm-hmm. The violence is not that person's fault. It's the person who's enacting the violence, who is making that choice, making that a choice, right? And I think it feels like it's your responsibility because you're told, do this or else.
You feel guilty even if it's not your responsibility.
Right.
And I mean, this is also not a century where the Jesuits are free of atrocity. You have the French Wars of Religion. You have some of the bloodier aspects of the English Reformation happening. There's a lot going on where the situation is less clear-cut regarding the idea of violence at the hands of apostatizing. But I think the interesting thing about this story is it is fairly direct. You have an idea of what culturally belongs, but you also have brutal, brutal violence.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think something else that's really interesting is, like, and you touched on this a little bit in the summary, is the idea of, like, Christian religion and culture in the Western setting, and then carrying that into a completely different culture, how different the circumstances are and how different the, like, application and practice of the religion has to be, because you can't just like, cut out and take everything as is in, like, Europe and just drop it in Japan and be like, here you go. It's very sobering seeing, like, Garupe and Rodriguez, like, come to grips with being like, okay, it really does, like, look different here. Sacraments look different. Tradition looks different. The outlook and, like, consequence for being Christian is different.
Absolutely.
And I don't come from, like, a high church background, but like the idea of like missionaries being like these people who like go and like suffer for their faith and like spread the gospel, and they're really hallowed for that. So the idea that like Garupe and Rodriguez kind of go to Japan possibly with that in their mind, but then are faced with like not just like the brutality of like what Japanese Christians are facing, but like I almost feel like Rodriguez especially is like tortured over the morality of literally bringing Christianity to the Japanese people, because there's a consequence for just converting people. Like that's a real thing that's going to impact them for the rest of their lives.
I grew up, my mother was a missionary in Zimbabwe during the early days of Mugabe's reign. And growing up, I had a lot of friends who were in missions work in that part of Africa. For a lot of it, they were either in Chad or the Congo. And the idea of how do you make, first of all, proselytizing and the ethics of proselytizing as a whole conversation that is not in the scope of this podcast. But how do you make something true to your values and true to the beliefs you're trying to convey, but also culturally connecting? You know, we see this a lot with language barriers, where the nuances of language, where religion is a place where language matters the most, are not understood, but also the cultural understanding of what tradition is. Not even what these traditions are, but what the idea of tradition is something that's really interesting, because they take it so personally and so profoundly as such a traditional practice. I think the Jesuits are shocked at how easily these Japanese Christians are willing to martyr themselves. It is instinctual. And, you know, obviously you can draw a lot of comparisons to the early church history here.
I also think like when people are persecuted, it makes you want to cling more tightly to your faith, right?
Absolutely.
Because if you've seen your family or your friends killed for this faith, your faith has to be worth it, right? Like you can't give up on that faith, because then your friends and your family have died in vain. And so there is this way that like the persecution itself makes the people cling more tightly to that faith, right? Even though that's the opposite effect is what the people doing the persecution want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also the aspect of this is a period of essentially cultural purification by those in power. The Christianity was not the only influence under attack. It was an era of attempting to return to a purer Japan and dismantling a lot of systems that had been in place for a couple hundred years prior. So it's not like even their faith was necessarily the only stake on the line.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, a culture that's willing to execute people for their religion is probably willing to execute people for other things, their ethnicity, their social value, their disabilities, whatever. So that is an interesting idea of is it standing up for your faith, or is it standing up for the value of human life? Which the Roman Catholic Church would definitely argue is the same thing.
Right. But then the question is like, if someone is giving you that choice, like Rodriguez was given, right?
Yeah.
What is the right choice to make?
Yeah.
And I don't think this film offers an easy answer to that.
No, and I think it very intentionally, I think it's sympathetic towards Rodriguez, but I don't think it answers the question of the value of apostatizing. You know, he is not, he is not one of those remembered as martyred saints because he apostatized. There is documentation that he apostatized. And that has been a point of contention for hundreds of years at this point. Scorsese humanizes him, but I still don't think I think he portrays that Rodriguez understood the cost and still made that choice, which at that point, I think pretty much all Christian theology would agree that is before a higher power at that point.
Right. I think one of the characters I find the most interesting in this film is Chijiro, the their
fisherman.
guide, the fisherman.
has
and
lost
his,
everything, keeps coming back.
Right. And so, yeah, I find his character so fascinating, and his relationship with Rodriguez, especially the ways that, especially at the end, there are questions about, is Rodriguez kind of using Cathedral to still teach in an underground way?
I was going to say, yeah, Kojichiro is also one of the most interesting characters to me as well. Because when I was watching the movie, and I don't know if he's him or a person like him is featured in the book, but he kind of reminds me of like Peter from the Bible, who there's an account where he denies Christ multiple times, but then is like martyred, later in life. Kind of parallels Kojichiro in this film, because he does deny or apostatize or whatever multiple times throughout the movie, but then at the end seems to be deeply convicted and refuses to.
There's a difference between not having profound beliefs and not having the strength to overcome fear.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Is it cowardice? Maybe. The film doesn't. The film isn't interested in casting judgment. And in fact, it checks Rodriguez's judgment when Rodriguez is hesitant to offer him absolution.
Yes. Mm-hmm. The kind of, when Rodriguez initially is like very happy to give him absolution, is very happy to hear his confession. And then kind of throughout the story, Rodriguez is kind of put on the test himself about how many times is he going to give him absolution, because Rodriguez's like faith and his journey is also going through a lot of fire. And yeah, the way he is tested, where he's clearly just so frustrated with Kojichiro, even though like we know according to like his practice and his faith, like if you confess and get absolution, like you're forgiven. Kojichiro really like tests the bounds of like how much forgiveness can you get? And Rodriguez kind of tested on the bounds of how much forgiveness can he give.
And again, that's down to, does he express contrition?
Yeah.
Well, and I think he does. Yeah. Right. I think he truly does. He does.
He's profoundly
feel
traumatized.
Sorry for what he's done. It's also I feel like a priest normally who hears confession and offers forgiveness, absolution, right, is not offering absolution for something that happened to themselves.
Right.
And that's where it gets so much harder for Rodriguez, right?
Yeah.
Because he knows that like God offers forgiveness.
Yeah.
But is he able to forgive?
Yeah.
Right? And I think those are two different questions that aren't normally so interwoven.
Yeah.
And would God value his sacrifice over the choice? And that is truly an unknown, and there is no human answer for that.
Right.
And like comparing that to the fact that at that point, I think the next to last time Kojichiro like confesses to him, I think at that point Rodriguez has like stayed true, has not apostatized, has not done that. So like he's also in this weird position where he's like going through it for his faith, and he keeps having this guy who keeps renouncing again and again, coming back to like get forgiveness. And Rodrigo's in this position of like, well, I haven't done that. And
it's pride.
Messy and complicated. Yeah.
Right. Does Rodriguez refuse to offer absolution the final time he comes when he says, I'm no longer a priest?
I believe he does. And I think that's valid to say that.
Right. Which is interesting, right? So
theologically, they're both kind of in the same situation of not being able to have the sacrament of absolution before what will eventually be their death.
Right.
So that really is putting trust in God.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the plot. We talk about the moral dilemma here. Scorsese is so interested in visuals in this movie. And that's not to say that it doesn't offer great depth in its storytelling, but the story is compelling enough on its own without any flourishes. This is Scorsese being able to make a biblical epic using the grand scale of cinematography to tell this story without being constrained to a first century setting. You see the images of the clear parallels to the crucifixion of Christ in how they are executing these martyrs. You see these landscapes. You see the vision he has. All of these elements are playing with very established ideas of how we visually represent Christianity and subverting that by being so contemporary.
Obviously, right, the scene where there are the three martyrs executed on the 3 crosses, right? Like, that's very symbolic. And the one who was in the center, I would say he was somewhat like a Christ figure, right? Like, he was the one that was kind of leading the village, right?
Yeah.
And I read an article, and they were saying that when Rodriguez actually apostatized, in the background a rooster crowed, right? Which is an allusion to when Peter denied Christ, and then a rooster, and before the rooster crowed, right? So there is all of these ways that the cinematography is bringing out the allusions to the gospel.
There's also the sound design, which is intensely atmospheric and very minimalist. Scorsese is a director that we think of using a lot of score, a lot of needle drops, and he's very restrained in this film. There's very little, there's no non-diegetic music. There's very little there that feels out of place to the actual events around them.
Well, and that's also, I think, the title of the film, Silence, right?
Yep.
That is part of the purpose, right? It's that I think Scorsese is trying to draw us into the silence, even when it's not absolute silence, right? Like the silence of what's happening in the world, right? The waves that are crashing. But there's still a silence in the voices that are being extinguished, right?
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting how badly the studio failed marketing this movie. It didn't find an audience, and I don't know how anyone ever expected it to, because it's such a striking but also sparse movie in the attention it demands from you, but also how little it gives you as far as sound, as far as traditional narrative. It breaks a lot of rules and very much goes on just vibes. So for someone who, had recently seen The Wolf of Wall Street or Shutter Island or The Departed, seeing, it's Martin Scorsese's new movie, let's go see this. Don't know what it's about. The trailers definitely didn't give you much clue what it's about. How was this meant to succeed? Was this just Scorsese using his power to be able to make a movie on this scale? It feels like that.
I was reading somewhere that this was like a passion project of his that he'd been working on for a really long time. Yeah, like the fact that it came out in 2016, 2017?
Yep. 2016.
And he was working on it in the 90s. Movies like this don't get just like casually made. It requires someone with as much oompa as like Scorsese to make them, because I can't imagine any studio just casually being like, yeah, we'll make this.
No one wants to touch this.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's not going to make money, right? Like,
exactly.
This is not a story that people aren't going to go see this in the theaters.
And if there's one thing that succeeded at, it is definitely not making money. The film had a $50 million budget before marketing, and it made 23. So it's really... I think it's noteworthy that this is Scorsese's last film he did with a traditional studio. The Irishman was produced with Netflix, where they just want the prestige. They'll throw money at him. Killers of the Flower Moon is produced by Apple TV. So in many ways, this could be argued as the last attempt to produce this kind of serious movie that requires your attention, requires you to not be staring at your phone, requires you to be engaged and contemplative. And ultimately, it failed. I don't think a movie like this would get made today on the scale with the cast that it has.
Right. I mean, Liam Neeson, right? Adam Driver.
Yep. And so Adam Driver and Andrew Garfield really committed to this role. They both spent an extended period of time living with the Jesuits in New York City, shadowing consultant on the film, Father James Martin, who is a prominent Catholic author and queer theologian. They really spent a lot of time immersing themselves in what does the rule of life that these characters live under mean. And I've given a lot of interviews of how meaningful that was to the vision of what the end goal of this project was. It really feels like for everyone on the project, it was just a labor of love.
Yeah. And the physicality of like what Driver and Garfield also went through, like in terms of like shooting, like apparently they had to not be eating very much because they had to appear, you know, emaciated and tortured.
Yeah.
The pure dedication from like everybody involved. And what makes it so sad is this, again, it's a hard movie to then turn around to someone casually and be like, hey, let me show you this movie. It's just not the kind of movie that you're going to be able to like word of mouth to people.
No one casually suggests it for a movie night.
Exactly. Like,
No.
no.
No. But it's a great movie for studying, for talking about, because it's so rich and doesn't offer easy answers.
Yeah. I really love that it doesn't offer any kind of
of reflection that is very timely for the movie. But yeah, Driver just had an insane year that year. He made this film, which is intensely required a huge amount of dedication. He made Patterson with Wim Wenders, the Meyerowitz stories with Noah Baumbach, and then he made a little movie called The Force Awakens, all in 1 year.
And yet probably people know him for Star Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is our second Adam Driver movie of the podcast, I think.
And both bangers.
Both certified bangers.
Francis
I meant to start a bingo card for all the Star Wars actors that show up, but I didn't. Oh, well.
Liam Neeson also is in Star Wars.
Yes.
That's true, yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Liam Neeson is also
two Star
really
Wars
great here.
and Spider-Man.
He is. Right? I thought Liam Neeson's performance was great because he's done so many of these like action movies that are fun to watch, but I don't know how much acting talent they require.
Very empty. Usually, and like quite frankly, it kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth these days, given the racial politics of the Taken series, the misogyny of the Taken series.
Right.
It has really damaged his career for me. So to see a role like this and how much he can bring to the table really reminded me how much he has on offer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. He is a really good actor.
Speaking of fantasy and sci-fi connections, don't forget he's the voice of Aslan in the Disney Narnia movies.
That's what I was just about to say. He's the voice of Aslan, and that was one of the first Liam Neeson roles that I knew him from because of my age group. So for me, it's like Liam Neeson, voice of Aslan, and then in this movie, and Aslan is a well-known like Christ allegory, and then in this movie, it's like Liam Neeson is playing this like religious priest who's apostatized his faith. Like for me, I was kind of having a moment where I was watching it and I was like, oh man, this is hitting different.
Another notable Neeson role that on the surface is very different, but I think he's played very tonally similarly is his role in Schindler's List as Oskar Schindler.
Oh yeah.
That kind of grave decision making. He brings a real gravitas that he doesn't have a ton of screen time, honestly, in the film, but it is so consistently rewarding.
I think one of the things to talk about in this film is where God is and God shows up or doesn't show up. Because I think the film's title is Silence, right? And there's this line, and I think it's Liam Neeson's character, Ferreira, who says that, or maybe it's Rodriguez, and I don't remember, one of them talks about how in the silence is where they hear God.
Absolutely.
And so, and what does that mean, right? Like, where is God in this movie, right? Like, we have Rodriguez's vision of Jesus telling him it's okay to apostatize, right? And then there's this question of, did he remain true to his faith even though he'd apostatize repeatedly?
Yeah. Is his vision accurate or is he desperate? You can have some very rewarding, faithful or cynical takes on this film.
Right.
Scorsese isn't interested in dwelling into the specifics of that. He's more interested in the idea, and I think that's very rewarding. Right. And it leaves it up to us to kind of draw the conclusions ourselves, right? Because I feel like, and maybe this is, I feel like Rodriguez's decision to apostatize was a faithful decision. Absolutely.
And he in some ways lost more by apostatizing than he would have if he had simply let himself be executed.
Well, for a person of faith for a Christian of faith, what is the value of their life? That's not what's at primary stake for them. And that's where the rubber meets the road as far as how you're willing to test that.
Right. Well, but it's also like he gave up by apostatizing. He gave up his livelihood.
Yep.
His ability to ever return home.
His respect.
His respect. His everything he'd ever known, right? And so in some ways that was a choice to die. Like his former life died when he did that.
Absolutely.
And so in some ways, right, like that is, and he saved those other people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And in some ways you could argue he probably saved Christianity in that region.
Yeah.
The regime that they are in does not last long. Christianity will return to Japan in a fairly short amount of time. This region of Japan is still heavily Christian.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I know there's like people alive today who are just direct descendants from those like Japanese Christians.
Yeah. I think what's so interesting about the Japanese martyrs in this time is, sure, it's 500 years ago, but it feels much more contemporary than a lot of other tales of martyrdom without having the modern political systems that we hear in modern martyrs of religion.
Yeah.
So it's a little uncanny.
Right. It felt very contemporary. The story felt very relatable.
There are nations today that you could swap the names on and have a very believable story.
Yeah.
On that note, speaking of believable stories, Killers of the Flower Moon. So this is obviously a fairly recent release. It just hit Apple TV a few months ago. It came out last year during the awards season. Obviously, to get another film directed by Martin Scorsese. This film, co-produced by Apple and Paramount. Apple made the decision to give it a long and well-deserved theatrical run, which is a rare strategy by streamers, and I have to applaud it because I got to see this film on the largest IMAX in the United States while I was the only person in the theater, and that was a special experience.
That's a real movie moment for you.
Right?
You were the protagonist in your own movie.
I drove to a 10 a.m. showing. Do you know what it's like to go to a 3.5-hour movie at 10 a.m.?
I'm not going to lie to you. I don't.
Yeah, yeah.
I double featured it with Stop Making Sense. That was a hell of a day.
Nice.
The film made a bunch of money for a film that is predominantly on streaming. It had a very successful theatrical run, and Apple does not release metrics for their streaming films, so we have to believe it's also been a very big success for them on their platform. This is, of course, in contrast to Silence, which is considered to be a massive flop. It's also available on disc. However, the caveat there is it is only available on disc in Italy, where even the 4K Blu-ray, which is supposed to not have any region locking, is in fact illegally region locked. So you will need to have a European Blu-ray player. It also has Italian intertitles with subtitles instead of English language intertitles that are present in the US region version. But otherwise, it offers significantly improved qualities over the streaming version, and you should support anytime a streaming film gets released on physical media because it has become such a rarity. This is the version of the film that Sarah and I watched. It is a really wonderful release with some really interesting special features. But as I said, it's also available on Apple TV+. The story of Killers of the Flower Moon is based on David Grann's true crime novel about the FBI's investigations into massacres within the Osage Nation occurring in the 1920s and 1930s. The screenplay is written by Eric Roth, who is a previous Scorsese collaborator, along with Scorsese himself, and it's Leonardo DiCaprio as Ernest Burkhart, Robert De Niro as William King Hale, Lily Gladstone as Molly Burkhart, and Jesse Plemons in a fairly small but notable role because he totally steals the scene as the FBI investigator Thomas Bruce White Sr. Man, does Jesse Plemons do a great job. I know a lot of the attention for this film has gone to Lily Gladstone's performance, but every scene Plemons is in just absolutely makes me want to go rewatch Breaking Bad. The cinematography is done by longtime Scorsese collaborator Rodrigo Prieto, and it managed to have 10 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor, Cinematography, Editing, Production, Costuming, Score, and Song. However, it won none of them because this was the year of Oppenheimer.
I didn't realize. Wait, yeah, I did not put that together. 2023 was.
Yeah, these awards happened. These awards.
It didn't win anything?
That's
It didn't
criminal.
win anything from the Academy.
I have not seen Oppenheimer, but that is a crime.
As someone who's a big cynic about Nolan, Oppenheimer is quite good if you can ignore the fact that that story is really messy. But yeah, no, it won absolutely nothing from the Academy, and it won nothing at the BAFTAs. Did very well with Critics' Choice. Actual local critics associations did very well there. Lily Gladstone won a Golden Globe, which, how seriously you take the Golden Globes, whatever, it's an incredibly well-deserved role. And that is it for major awards. But at a certain point, I know the Academy has become drastically more diverse in the past decade, but when films like this don't get anything, you have to kind of wonder, did it just make people too uncomfortable? It was a very crowded year, but man, there's some fantastic performances here.
So the film follows Ernest Burkhart and his relationship with his wife, Molly Burkhart, who is a member of the Osage Nation. This kind of follows the murders that were committed in the 1920s in Oklahoma against the Osage people, specifically for money reasons, to get headright money. So in 1919, Ernest Burkhart returns from World War I to stay with family. His uncle is played by Robert De Niro, or William King Hale. Hale basically conspires with Ernest to have him marry Molly Burkhart, who is from this very wealthy Osage family. She has several sisters, and they have profited quite well off of the oil that was discovered on Osage land in previous years that have made them one of the wealthiest peoples. I think globally at that point, oil was extremely valuable.
Yep.
And still is. But basically, Ernest's uncle, using Ernest directly, arranges for these sisters to get murdered one by one. It's very much like, it is a crime movie, but it's a crime movie that's not like a procedural. It's, you are following along the events of the crime as it's happening and not trying to unravel the mystery afterwards. So each of these sisters, one at a time, are getting killed either by being shot in the head in the woods, going missing. One of Molly's sisters is in a house that is rigged with explosives with her husband and housekeeper, and the house is absolutely destroyed. And the point that the movie drives home throughout is the fact that no one's investigating these deaths. People are just sort of being like, oh, how sad, and moving on. And people like Hale, who, again, is directly conspiring with Ernest to kill off these women in order for Ernest, and by extension Hale, to get these headright money. He is very clearly declaring himself a friend of the Osage, a friend of the community. He's going out of his way to be like, I am your truest friend. The movie really does paint that two-facedness of that. Things kind of come to a head where Molly clearly knows something's up. Her sisters have been murdered. Her mother passes away from, seems like, a long-term frailty or illness. And Molly tries to go to the Capitol to try and get support and an investigation, because, again, no one's investigating these murders.
Worth noting that the previous detectives that were hired with the help of William Hale have disappeared. Yeah.
And it's crazy, just sidebar from the plot here, it's crazy how Ernest just goes along with things that he is told to do. And he is in no small way directly impacts the awful things that are being done to these women at every turn, as Molly's husband. And at the same time, the film is portraying him as deeply loving Molly, caring about her well-being. It's deeply uncomfortable to watch. Him, hug his Osage wife and kiss her and tell her how much he loves her, and then see him rob their Osage neighbors for their money.
And he's comforting her in her illness, right? Mm-hmm. And also actively poisoning her.
Yes.
Right. It's such it's such a contrast, right? Because there's such good acting. It really does seem like they love each other.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he's also actively trying to kill her.
Yeah. And
for her money.
Yeah, because she has, just to clarify a little, Molly has diabetes and is one of the few people who has access to insulin. We later find out that Ernest, at Hale's command, has been lacing the insulin with something or replacing the insulin with something that basically...
I believe it was ketamine. Yeah,
drastically impacts her well-being. She can't get out of bed. She is basically dying and would have died if, later in the movie, intervention hadn't taken place. Basically, Molly was able to make it to the Capitol to do some lobbying and to try and ask for assistance. And the government do end up sending some FBI representatives down to kind of investigate. Various members of that team kind of infiltrate the local area to try to get the lay of the land, try to figure out what's up. But the real awfulness is that, basically, Hale and Ernest have this network of white Americans in the area who have all kind of conspired to kill off these people, these Osage women. And so everybody's kind of working to cover each other's back so that no one gets caught. But to the eyes of the FBI agents, it does become, fairly obvious when, the only living member of this particular family is Molly, who's married to Ernest. And Ernest seems suspiciously, somehow tangentially involved with these other murders. So the FBI do pull Ernest in for questioning. And a previous event in the movie where Ernest had made a deal with someone in the area to steal his car so he could get insurance money on it comes back to bite him in the butt, where that particular guy basically spills all the beans and Ernest ends up being caught in his actions. And luckily, they're able to go get Molly and get her to a hospital. And at this time, she still doesn't know what Ernest has done. She doesn't know he's poisoned her. As far as she knows, he's innocent because everything seems to be getting pinned on Hale. For protection, Ernest basically agrees to testify against Hale, his uncle, but then gets persuaded not to by his uncle's defense, saying, you're going to hang yourself by your own confession if you, actually try and, testify against him. Again, Molly, who is now recovered from the hospital, he's telling her, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just going to go to court for a little while. And then he does kind of have this moment where his 4-year-old daughter tragically passes away from whooping cough. And he kind of has a moment where a change of heart at the very last minute, where he decides to testify against Hale because he doesn't want Hale anywhere near his family. He kind of gets a real consequence of for once, a family member that he really cares about actually dying, which we can get into during the discussion. He ends up testifying against Hale. All of them go to jail, charged with various murders of these women. Ernest later gets out on, I believe he gets pardoned later on, which is insane. And Hale also gets out on parole later on. And the movie ends in a really sobering way because up until this moment, we've spent very intimate time with all of these characters. It's a very long movie and you are totally in the moment and in the story. And then suddenly we switch to, it's a radio drama that is being read out to a live audience where they're kind of dramatizing the events of this murder for an audience. And then Scorsese steps out to speak his piece. He basically talks about how really no consequences put on these men for their atrocious actions. And they basically got off scot-free. He talks about how Hale returns to the community later on, even though he's supposed to never set foot in Oklahoma again, and basically just outlines the absolute shamelessness of just showing up like that. Makes me angry. Anyway, and the film kind of just reminds us basically these criminals, again, who were after money, they were taking out insurance, blowing stuff up, murdering people for their wealth, basically didn't get any consequences for it. But the pain that was caused and that the Osage Nation still has from these murders still is going on today. Change anything, or you can't underscore the impact of basically systemically removing the wealth from this people group to line pockets of local white settlers who've moved in.
Right. I mean, that money was taken out of that community and has never
This
returned.
is a long history of money in that community being mismanaged. There's also another big part of that ending with Scorsese addressing camera is that Molly was the first of them to die. She dies just a few years after this trial from diabetes-related complications. And they saw being old men. They got to experience that. They were set back by the legal process, but they were not ruined by it. And that is the most chilling reality here. They got away.
Yeah. Like, I think she divorces Ernest and then literally only lives a few years afterwards.
This film, first of all, it's 3.5 hours, and it does not feel like it.
No.
It truly is a testament to Thelma Schumacher's editing skills that this film is tighter than a lot of 90-minute films you see.
Yeah.
I also can't help but draw comparisons that the film itself makes to Tulsa.
Yeah.
You
definitely.
even see the Osage watch newsreel clips of the Tulsa massacre, which is very nearby, and say, this could happen to us. And ultimately, the era of Osage wealth didn't come to an end, not by physical violence on a grand scale. You know, this is the most notable event, but by essentially theft and mismanagement. So how does our country reckon with minorities in power is a real test of how well our country is willing to deal with diversity.
Right. And I think the reason this wasn't investigated, and even when it was, there weren't any real consequences, is that, right, the perpetrators were white men, the victims were women of color, and their crimes benefited white people, right? Like, there was already this suspicion that the Native Americans shouldn't have that wealth anyway, right? Like, they couldn't be trusted to use that money in a way that would benefit us, right? And so
and like the movie, they point out that like the Osage have like guardians, like they don't even actually have access to their wealth. They have to like negotiate for literally everything, including like Molly is seen negotiating for like medical bills, things like that. You know, it's their money, and they have to negotiate for it. So like the way that they're treated, like it's not their money.
The term they use is incompetent, which is a whole mess there of problems. But why are they deemed not responsible enough to care for their money? It's not just because they're Osage.
It's because they're women.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, the men are, you see the Osage men having the excesses, drinking away their wealth, etc. It's because they're women who don't have a man.
Right.
Right.
When the tribe is seeking help, Molly goes to try to meet with the president, and the president, she's able to have a conversation with him. That president is Calvin Coolidge. Like how intensely linked white nationalism was to our culture is incredible. This is a film in which you have J. Edgar Hoover is essentially the good guy, which is troubling enough because of just how heinous everyone else is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
This might be going into like left field a little bit, but maybe not. But one thing that really struck me is the way that Leonardo DiCaprio's character, the individual relationships that he has with like Molly, compared with like his perceptions of the Osage as a whole. And it really reminds me of like situations where like a white person might say to a friend who's a person of color, well, like, I like you, you're my friend, but they're unable to conceptualize of like the fellow members of people of that minority group as also being like people, you know?
Right.
Like, oh, you're not like the other ones or whatever. And it's
the good Negro stereotype. You know, this is something we've seen time and time again in media, in portrayals. It's you divide, and when you have something you want from a minority, you separate them and say, oh no, you're not like the rest of your people.
Yeah.
Well, I do think that's part of it is the loving relationship. But I also think there's something to say that he's portrayed as being maybe having an intellectual disability as well, right? There is some question about his ability to really understand what's happening around him, and he's very easily manipulated.
Yep.
And so what does that mean too?
He's also just returned from the war.
Right.
So is this intellectual disability? Is this PTSD? Is this just being a trusting person? We don't know, but it's very easy to paint Ernest as a sympathetic character at the start of this movie. In fact, you kind of expect it's going to remain as sympathetic because you feel like he's caught up in these bad actions. And the movie never really directly contrasts that. It contrasts that with the reality around him. So you have to have this realization of just how convincing he is as a kindly simpleton, while in reality he's taking direct part in and is fully complicit in the murder of over a dozen people.
I always wonder too, my question is like, was he fully aware of his uncle's plans before he married Molly? Right? Or is that something that happens after they're married that his uncle then tells him, by the way, you married her, now let's kill her? Right? Like what happens there?
I think we see in the film's portrayal that even after they'd married, William Hale didn't directly say, now we're going to kill them all. He dribbled it out as advantageous. He masked it in a way that everyone should be able to see through the mask. But it's easy to understand from what we've seen of Ernest that he didn't fully understand why what was happening was wrong. And I think it's really tricky when we're talking about people who have committed mass acts of terror like this to discuss the fact that they might not be fully as engaged with their actions as everyone else.
Yeah,
Right.
I think Hale's character really plays to the self-entitlement that a white man would have about money. And he plays with those emotions with DiCaprio's character because he's like, we'll get rid of Rita and we'll get rid of the other sisters because that will keep the money in the family. It'll be for you and your kids. When in reality, super obvious to us, the viewer, that Hale is going to knock off Ernest and Molly and the kids and get the money himself. Like that's very clear to us, the viewer, but not so clear to Ernest, the character, because, you know, again, you can take different readings of his, maybe what his perspective was, you know, when committing these actions.
He openly admits that he is not a bright person.
But yeah, but playing to someone's like, well, this is your money and you deserve it. So why not go, you know, commit these atrocious acts? Like it almost rationalizes it for him in a way that would be uncomplicated for like a white man in the 20s.
You also have William Hale is a master manipulator. He's manipulating every single person in this film. He's manipulating Ernest. He's manipulating Molly. He's manipulating the entire tribe. And he has done a very good job of selling an image that he is actually one of the tribe's biggest allies. He has forged these relationships on false pretenses over a period of decades. So he is... It's kind of unfathomable the level of deceit that he's committing here. And the real parallel I think of is the scene where they're having the council meeting where he is their guest to discuss how to get attention to investigate. And he's it's said that he has been a long friend of the tribe and he is there with them to put his money where his mouth is and try to aid help and match what they've fundraised. Almost immediately after that, just a couple minutes after that, you have a scene at Ernest's home where he and his wife are visiting, and they openly, in front of everyone, use racial slurs to refer to his own grandchildren. That really lets you grasp the level of contempt he actually has.
And he justifies it because of money and racism, right? Like he really... The William Hale character, I think, doesn't see what he's doing as wrong.
No.
Right?
Fact,
because he thinks the wealth should belong.
At some point, he basically quotes American exceptionalism, that it's their duty to have these resources.
Right.
And he invokes scripture to justify that. Which is a very, very common thing that we've seen throughout the history of colonization. We've seen this used to promote, supersessionism over the Jews. We've seen this to inspire crusades. We've seen this to promote genocide. This is very common, to believe that you have a destiny to overtake the lives and the resources of another people.
Right. Which is a misreading of scripture.
Absolutely.
In my mind.
And very much from the same school of theology, at least this American form that we're seeing at this time, very much from the same school of theology that also said that the Bible would support slavery, would support many of the crimes of the early American civil rights issues. Right,
because it's the hierarchy of the races was part of their understanding of how God ordained the world to be. Yeah. Right, and the hierarchy of the races, the hierarchy of the sexes, and so challenging that was tantamount to challenging God.
Yeah, and once you have God as a reason or as an approval stamp, or the Bible as an approval stamp, then you're kind of just have free reign to just, run with it without opposition.
Right.
And there is a very palpable divide here, not just on ethnicity, but on religion, because the Osage are they're all Catholic. William Hale, he quotes the King James Bible. We have to assume he's Protestant, but there is a class divide. Hale is waspy, and he's also a Freemason. These are these symbols of power in white America and the white upper class.
Right, right.
To the point where some of these crimes, his attempts to flip, his attempts to blackmail Ernest occur in a Freemason lodge, compared to the Catholicism of Molly and her family and her tribe. And some of the only good advice Molly receives from anyone in this film is from a priest. It's the only real comfort she has is from a Catholic priest.
I do want to talk about Molly a little bit because I think it's really important that this film doesn't paint her as like a naive victim or someone who is unaware of their situation. Like, she is a woman with her own power, and she's very aware of the fact that, like, even Ernest wants her money when he's flirting with her, but
everyone wants her money.
Everybody wants her money. She's rich. But like the fact that she falls in love with Ernest, and the fact that she makes her own like conscious decisions throughout the movie, I think is really like powerful and also very important to this film.
She's also educated.
Yes.
She has a lot of resources a lot of people wouldn't have. She has wealth. She has education. She has incredible intellect that we see. That doesn't matter because she's vulnerable.
Right. Yeah.
Lily Gladstone is fantastic in this film.
It's such a fantastic.
This is the first movie I've seen her in, and now I need to go watch everything else she's ever been in.
You gotta, where to start? We're going to talk about Kelly Reichardt's Starring Woman at some point on this film. But Reservation Dogs, the TV show, is fantastic.
That's been on my list for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Where is that streaming?
I believe that's FX. I think that's Hulu. That feels like Hulu. That sounds like Hulu.
I think that's Hulu. That sounds right to me. I've heard good things about that.
FX is a Disney property, so it's one of the Disney services.
Okay. I've heard good things about it, so I should watch it too.
It's fantastic.
I will say what I like. So Molly, going back to her, I think she's such a fascinating character because I think she's so complicated, right? Like, she's clearly very smart. She knows that Ernest wants her money, and she still falls in love with him and marries him, right? And they have a really fascinating relationship. And she speaks her mind with him, right? Like, she's not afraid to tell him what she really thinks. And he comforts her as all these terrible things are happening to her, even though he is causing these terrible things, right? Like, but he is still, like, in some way, he still feels for her and still, like, mourns those losses, even while he is the one carrying them out. Because I think he doesn't quite understand those relationships.
The most complicated part of this movie is I truly believe that Ernest loved Molly and Molly loved Ernest.
Right.
And the grave actions of Ernest and William is what got in the way of that. But at their core, I think they truly did love each other. I wish we had some kind of historical record of Molly talking more freely about her mind and her opinions in the years after all this, but unfortunately we're not given that because of her health. I also think there's something said about disability from the angle of she is noticeably less engaged when she is sicker, when she is not getting her medication, and obviously when she is being drugged. So they are removing her ability to participate. They are forcibly making her submissive in that situation because she is too sick to engage. She's too sick to go out and fight. She's too sick to even often argue.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, what do you think about the fact that at the end it moves to like a radio drama that's being used for like true crime entertainment? What are y'all's thoughts on that?
It's a bold choice. It was the main thing people were talking about when the film released.
It was a bit of a shock, right? Because it is kind of like a sudden thing.
It reminds me, and I do think this is more nuanced than that, but it reminded me of Spike Lee's Black Klansman when it suddenly cut to the footage of Charlottesville.
Mm.
It's shocking, but also I feel like it's warranted. It's a real grounding point to remind you of just how easy it is for people to get away with this.
I think for me, it also reminded me of like how the real life experiences and traumas that people suffer can be commercialized for entertainment and reduced to entertainment. And
absolutely.
We've also just
ads.
sat and watched a 3.5-hour movie about said thing. Like it gets very like meta. But especially
Also, we are not listening to the accounts of these people. We are listening to a story which is passed through a bunch of other people with other interests.
Yeah.
I thought it was actually nice in a way because it made it more clear that it was an actual historical thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Instead of just this like film that you were watching that was really well done, right? Like I was really surprised it was 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
And so it made the relationship between what we'd just seen portrayed and what the reality of it was. I think it heightened that tension by having it jump to this so clearly entertainment form of information.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I had not thought about that.
Also just avoided the cliche of the biopic that has the title cards at the end saying what happened.
That's a good point.
Scorsese's not going to stoop to that. Why do that when you could have a cellist doing a needle drop?
I mean, always do the cellist with a needle drop. But because no one really, I think, really knew about this. Like, we're not taught about this in schools.
No.
So that is like, put it on the list with several other things. But like, that is a really good point, what you just pointed out, Mother Maryann, about like the fact that it does kind of contextualize like of it being like a real thing and not just someone walking out of the theater and being like, oh, what an insane movie.
And I think it definitely feels like an elevated drama at a lot of points. And then you actually read the accounts and you're like, oh no, that's what happened. That like, it's pretty accurate. Obviously the thing that is not well documented is the interpersonal stuff. We don't know what Ernest and William Hale were discussing. We don't know the true conversations between Molly and her husband. But other than that, it doesn't embellish much of anything.
Yeah, like with both this and Silence, it's like you wouldn't believe it unless like you knew it was true. But I think it also like Scorsese kind of reminds like nothing is quite as insane as like actual history.
Absolutely.
And I think both Silence and Killers of the Flower Moon really illustrate that because like the things that happen in both of those films are insane.
Also, history
Right.
doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have other key events occurring around us. You have, the stock market crash. You have the Tulsa massacre. You have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The rise of the second Ku Klux Klan. All of these things are happening around them, and our characters are observing them and reacting to them. So it's very easy for us to look at one story and not fully grasp everything that was going on culturally that created this atmosphere.
Yeah.
And created the atmosphere that allowed the perpetrators to get away without much punishment, right? That didn't value the death of those women, or didn't value their lives.
This is an era before modern civil rights laws where the federal government's ability to prosecute in these cases is fairly limited. So if the local prosecutors are not interested in really putting energy into things,
right,
people will get away. And think not just, Hale went down. Sure, he spent almost no time in jail, but he still was a felon. Think about how many people were complicit and never saw any criminal charge.
Right. I mean, how many other women died, right? Like this focuses on one family, but it was a lot.
It's considered to be most likely hundreds.
Right. Which is part of how the wealth was stolen.
Yep. And the wealth, this led to, sure, there were other issues down the road with mismanagement of funds, but this directly led to laws being passed, basically saying that non-Osage cannot inherit head rights to the finances.
One thing that I thought of when watching this film, because again, like it is set in the 20s, which is now 100 years ago, it does remind me like today, a lot of the relevance that you can take from this, specifically with the fact that a disproportionate number of like Indigenous and Native American women go missing, are murdered, the people who've committed these awful crimes against them are not being pursued. Like,
right.
Yeah, this is 100 years ago, but this is also very relevant to today. And I think that is really striking in where the various women are being shown murdered. Whoever's narrating it is saying like, no investigation, so-and-so suicide, no investigation, like listing these people. And you're reminded today, like there are so many people who go missing. No one's looking for them. People who are murdered, no one's looking for their killers.
Or even if someone is, because of systematic injustice, the wait time for a DNA test to identify someone can be in the years.
Yeah.
Right.
And all those time, like these communities are like suffering from that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really just an exceptional film that everyone should see. And if you ever have the opportunity, I know it is still playing in some places, please go see it on a big screen. I'm really excited for what Scorsese's doing next with his film on the life of Christ. I think it's going to be really interesting. Probably one of my most anticipating films coming up. But thank you so much, Maryann, for joining us. You have been a delight.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Next week, we'll be diving into the world of Italian realism with Bicycle Thieves, Umberto D. and La Strada.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a ratings or review anywhere that you've listened to our podcast. And thank you so much for listening. And I'll catch you next week, Kyle, and hopefully catch you some other time too, Mother Maryann.
Absolutely. This has been a blast. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.